Everyone, as Suzanne mentioned, my name is Abigail Epplett. If you've known me a long time, I'm Abby Epplett, and I am a master's candidate in the Museum Studies program at Tufts University. And also mentioned, I created an online exhibition for the Blackstone Heritage Corridor back during my practicum over the summer, and I focused on the life of Abby Kelley Foster. I used her letters, diaries, newspapers from the time, and other artifacts hosted by organizations in the area, which includes the Worcester Historical Museum, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, the Boston Public Library, the Library of Congress, and many, many other organizations. I was able to combine these primary resources with biographies and other articles about the life of Abby Kelley Foster and her friends and family in order to create this project. And I learned a lot about both her life and the lives of people in the Blackstone River Valley. So a lot of people might not be familiar with the life of Abby Kelley Foster. This is because despite her extensive work through two major human rights movements, she is not as well remembered as her colleagues like Susan B. Anthony or William Lloyd Garrison. She had a lifelong career as a human rights activist, and she was known as a radical. Her call for social reform advocated for the abolition of slavery, universal suffrage, and equality for all. These beliefs were driven by her Quaker faith, and she also enjoyed the support of her equally radical family. So Abby Kelley's work ultimately paved the way for future suffragists, the civil rights movements, and two separate constitutional amendments. So the first thing to know about Abby Kelley Foster is that she had very strong religious beliefs. For much of her early life, she belonged to the Religious Society of Friends, and these people are popularly known as the Quakers. Most of us today know the Quakers as that friendly-looking man on the box of oats, but there was a lot more to their religion than that. This group began in the 17th century as a reaction against the hierarchy and rituals that dominated the Church of England, another Protestant Christian group. Their founder, George Fox, believed that each person was guided by an inner light that allowed them to make choices that were pleasing to God instead of having to rely on the decrees of a priest or a king. So Quakers have historically always advocated for abolition, universal suffrage, and prison reform. And one thing important about Quaker beliefs as well is that they are nonviolent. They do not participate in the military, and they have always looked for ways to peacefully talk about their beliefs. Later on in life, unfortunately, Abby Kelley would be denounced or excommunicated by her meaning, so she was no longer technically a Quaker by the end of her life, but she did keep these beliefs throughout her life, and it very much influenced what she would later say about, sorry about that. So how did Abby Kelley Foster's life begin? Her upbringing was unconventional, even by Quaker standards. She was born on January 15, 1811, to a large Quaker family in Pelham, Massachusetts. Now, one thing about Pelham is that it no longer exists. It was actually flooded during the creation of Quabbin Reservoir. So you can unfortunately not visit her birthplace. It is not there. But the Kelleys were subsistence farmers. That meant that they could only produce as much food and goods that the family could use in a single season. Because of this, they did not often have much money. They would move twice in her lifetime, both times to farms in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. So Abby Kelley was the 7th of 9 children, and 8 of them were daughters. Sometimes I'll hear questions about, well, what did the rest of Abby Kelley's family did, since she was such an activist? Were the other siblings activists as well? And many of them were. So first we see Nancy and Lydia. They were older half-sisters from her father's previous marriage. and we do not know very much about their lives. We do know quite a bit about the other siblings. So, for example, 3 of her sisters, Joanna, Olive, and Diana, were Christian socialists. They lived in the Hopedale community for many years, and it was a utopia dedicated to equality and freedom of religion. Ruth, sister number 4, was very much unlike her radical siblings. She lived a very quiet life as a housewife and tended to stay out of family affairs. The youngest sister, Lucy, was a notable entrepreneur, and she owned a boarding house in the Worcester area where Abby spent much of her later life. And their only brother, Albert, also does not seem to have much political activism, unlike much of his family. He was very close in age to Abby, so it's speculated that they grew up together and went to school together and did many of their chores together. But besides his childhood, we really don't know much about him. So the family belonged to the Friends Meeting House in Uxbridge, which is just down the street from where I live. It is still an active meeting house on Quaker Highway, and it is still meeting today. Now, unlike many of the Quakers that attend this house now, the Kelley family was not a very actively attending family. Even though they had meetings only once a month in those days, the Kelleys maybe went once or twice a year. And this would not bode well for Abby later in life. Also, it's interesting to note that Abby Kelley learned men's work like animal husbandry and keeping up the farm, along with women's work of cooking and cleaning, which is very unusual for girls at the time, likely because she was one of many sisters with only one brother, and so it was crucial for someone else to help her father around the farm. Through these different trials in life, Abby Kelley learned that she needed to go where she was least wanted, for there she was most needed. She understood that positive changes to the rules of society would only happen because someone had asked for them. As an activist, she would deliberately travel to difficult areas to advocate for universal suffrage and abolition, just as her Quaker ancestors had done. Now, along with having a unique background in the work that she did on her family farm, Abby Kelley had a unique education for her woman of her day. While living in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Kelley family made sure to send all of their daughters to the best private girls' schools available in Worcester. At this time, Abby proved to be a top student. However, there was no public high school available for girls in the city of Worcester when Abby became a teenager, so she attended the New England Friends boarding school, which is located in Providence, Rhode Island, and the school actually operates today as the Moses Brown School. It's named after its primary benefactor, Moses Brown, and you may recognize this name. He was also the founder of Brown University. Moses Brown himself was an abolitionist, and he advocated for women's rights. However, the Brown family fortune was rooted in slavery. The Brown ancestors were seafaring merchants, and they traveled across the Atlantic transporting and selling African slaves among a variety of other goods. So even though Moses Brown himself renounced the act of slavery, he still had benefited from it in his family history. But true to the beliefs of Moses Brown and his activism for women's rights, the school was co-educational from the very beginning, so both boys and girls were always allowed to go to the school, and it was the highest form of education for middle-class girls at that time. However, even though it was co-educational, classrooms and the playground were still segregated by gender. So while boys learned to become merchants and doctors and professors, girls are taught to become teachers, but at less prestigious schools. It was at this school where Abby Kelley first realized that she preferred equality and truth to harmony. She would later in life say, "Harmony? I don't want harmony. I want truth." Part of this is evidence that she was, in fact, the only girl in the school to be allowed to take bookkeeping, which today we call accounting. And in fact, she was the best young accountant at the school. She would utilize these skills later in life. She may become at times called the treasurer or the financial secretary of the American Anti-Slavery Society, run by William Lloyd Garrison, and today we would probably call that position a CFO. So she had a position of financial power at the time where women often were not actually allowed to own property. So here I must emphasize the prevalence of slavery throughout the United States during Abby Kelley's lifetime. I've mentioned earlier that even Quaker activists often had family members who owned slaves or were active in the slave trade. And this was true for many middle and upper class people throughout the United States. Even after the abolition of transatlantic slave trade by the United States government in 1808, slavery continued in the country until the passage of the 13th Amendment at the end of the American Civil War. Now, we often think of the South as being the place where there were large plantations that produced tobacco, cotton, and other goods, but absentee slave owners did frequently own houses in northern states, even after many of these states abolished slavery. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Abby Kelley and her husband Stephen Simmons Foster were among the nation's most recognized abolitionists. Other notable figures of this movement included Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Sojourner Truth. All three of these people were frequent correspondents of the Kelley Foster family and often worked alongside them. So Abby Kelley first started her career in the Anti-Slavery Society, the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Lynn. It began in 1835. She had just graduated from the Friends School in Providence, and she was sent to become a teacher of, course, a less prestigious school in Lynn, Massachusetts. In Lynn, she joined their chapter of the Female Anti-Slavery Society and was immediately promoted to corresponding secretary because she was such a good writer. This gave her an opportunity to write to activists across the United States and even internationally. Some of the more famous correspondents include William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, along with abolitionist sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke. By 1837, only 2 years after joining the society, she was selected as the society's delegate to the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women. This was held in New York City. And she also was sent as a delegate the next year in 1838 to the same convention. That time it was held in Philadelphia. It was at this Philadelphia convention that she gave her first speech and made a name for herself as an orator. She would quickly leave the teaching position at the Lynn Quaker School, and by 1839, she had already started a new career on the lecture circuit. It was through working entirely as an abolitionist that Abby Kelley would remark, "Bloody feet, sisters, have worn smooth the path by which you come hither." She worked tirelessly as an abolitionist, knowing that her work in this movement would aid her other vision, equal rights to women. You can see that this was part of a speech from the 1851 National Women's Rights Convention, which was held in her hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts. She told this to fellow suffragettes, acknowledging that the hard work in passing the 13th Amendment would, in time, create solutions for passing the 19th Amendment, that of the women's right to vote, some 55 years later. So even though she would not live to see the passage of that 19th Amendment, she understood that the work which would go into its passage was very similar to the work that would be done for the abolitionist movement. So as I mentioned before, as a young abolitionist, Abby Kelley had correspondence with many abolitionists, both in the US and also in Canada and in England. She had several mentors, pictured here, who taught her about giving speeches, writing essays, and even editing newspaper articles. So from left to right, we have first Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They were born into an extremely wealthy slave-owning family When the Grimke sisters grew up, they renounced their family, converted to Quakerism, and became abolitionists. Angelina, on the farthest left, was the first professional lecturer that Abby heard speak while she was a teacher in Lynn, Massachusetts. Both the Grimke sisters offered guidance to Abby throughout her early career. The next person over is Lucretia Mott, likely recognizable to anyone who has studied abolitionist history. She was highly impactful in the personal life and public life of Abby Kelley Foster. Both of them were birthright Quakers, so they had grown up in the Society of Friends. And Lucretia Mott offered significant advice to Abby Kelley and her work as an abolitionist. Finally, we might recognize William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He employed Abby as a lecturer, a general agent, and a financial manager. He really advocated for giving Abby Kelley Foster leadership roles within the society at a time where women were not allowed to have these roles. Now, it's important to note that Garrison and Abby Kelley did not always have the best relationship, especially later on in life, which I won't go into details here, but if this is something that interests people, I can certainly take questions on it at the end of the session. But Garrison was highly impactful in starting Abby Kelley's career. Of course, when talking about abolition, I would be remiss not to mention Stephen Simmons Foster. He was a somewhat lesser known member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He was a radical abolitionist and a supporter of universal suffrage. His best known tract was called The Brotherhood of Thieves, or A True Picture of the American Church and Clergy. This tract was published in 1844, and it featured his condemnation of churches who supported slavery. While this made him many enemies, in addition to damage of local towns caused by rioters who did not enjoy his speeches or his writing, Abby Kelley really enjoyed his letters and his writing. And she let him know in a letter saying, "Don't forget to send me 500 brotherhoods. I have read most of it and think, a la Foster, yes, quite in character, though entirely out of characters, 'tis as good as a daguerreotype. Have I spelt it right? Miniature." In fact, Abby Kelley had not spelt daguerreotype correctly. She was certainly a mathematically minded person, although spelling was not her strong suit. So it's not exactly clear when Abby Kelley and Stephen Simmons Foster first met. There are records that show they were on a boat ride together sometime in 1840 when they were traveling to the American Anti-Slavery Society convention that year. But we don't know if they met on this boat. This was an overcrowded boat, and today not so many people would have been allowed on that vehicle. But Stephen definitely knew who Abby Kelley was even before he met her. She was among the most famous abolitionists at that time because of her speaking and writing. Abby Kelley probably did not know who Stephen Simmons was until she met him. She first saw him speak a little while later in Concord, Massachusetts, and she enjoyed his fiery speaking style. They became pen pals around this time and had what is referred to as a letter writing courtship that lasted 4 years and finally ended in 1845 when they at last got married, much to the surprise of their friends and family. So as abolitionists, as part of the anti-slavery lecture circuit, much of the time they were not able to spend together until they ultimately retired after the Civil War. Abby, of course, was more famous. She had many more speaking and writing opportunities, and Stephen had a tendency to cause riots whenever he spoke, so he tended not to be a headline speaker. They were married in a Quaker-style ceremony, of course, in Pennsylvania, which was one of the few states that allowed people to get married without having a marriage license, something that I believe is not allowed in the U.S. anymore. And of course, their letters document much of their relationship. And now it's important to note that their letters are very different stylistically. Stephen's letters were filled with what Abby Kelley referred to as soft soap. He would pine for her to visit him on the lecture circuit and tell how much he loved her and wanted to be with her. Abby Kelley's letters tend to be very practical. She reminded him to maintain a nutritious diet, to bathe regularly and wash his hair, and to read books to relax. Considering this took place in the 1840s when the practices of good nutrition, regular bathing, and mental health were not something that was widely discussed or understood, Abby Kelley was certainly ahead of her time in this aspect, and I'm not sure if Stephen always appreciated the advice she gave him. They also shocked many when they had a child, Paulina Wright Foster, who was named after their close friend, fellow activist, and doctor, Paulina Kellogg Wright Davis. And they were even more shocking when Abby Kelley decided she was not going to retire and stay home to raise her child. She took a very brief maternity leave, even by modern standards, and she and her husband took turns caring for their daughter, whom they called Alla. Stephen, more often than not, was the primary caregiver. He tended to be a bit gentler and kinder with children, and Alla, of course, took full advantage of his loving and indulgent nature. So the Fosters' unique views on marriage are most evident, I believe, in this tag team speech given at the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. Stephen remarked in a set-up line, when the priest says to the woman, love, honor, and obey, what can she do? Abby Kelley elaborated further, but ultimately decided to say, I won't. So not only did the Fosters make themselves known as speakers on an abolitionist circuit, they also brought their beliefs into their own home. So they lived at Liberty Farm in Worcester, Massachusetts, which they first purchased in 1847, the year that their daughter Alla was born. An interesting side note, they never actually called the property Liberty Farm. That was something that their friends and family referred to it as, but they were a bit unhappy with that concept, although it was certainly deserving of that name. The Fosters used their home as a symbol for what they believed, as it was utilized as a stop on the Underground Railroad until the end of the Civil War. The Fosters were also known for refusing to pay taxes on their property, citing the reason because Abby was not allowed to vote. And today, the Liberty Farm is a National Historic Landmark along with a privately owned home. So besides speaking out against slavery through books and lectures, as I mentioned, they used their home as a stop on the Underground Railroad, aiding African-American freedom seekers in their journey of self-emancipation and providing supplies and guidance along the way. Their daughter, Alla, was always interested in teaching, and so she would teach former slaves how to read, usually doing so openly on the front steps of their house. In fact, much of the city of Worcester was known as a refuge or sanctuary city of its day. It was known for being very active in the Underground Railroad and for having other abolitionists in the area. Much of this activity was led by a Christian Universalist pastor named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was a very good friend of Stephen Sibbins, a few years younger than him. However, the two men did disagree on many issues, especially in the use of violence to gain human rights. As I mentioned before, Abby Kelley, as a Quaker, was a pacifist, and Stephen Simmons, although he was a Congregationalist, was also a pacifist. Higginson, on the other hand, was very supportive of violent radical action. He supported the raid of radical abolitionist John Brown. He also served as a leader of an otherwise all-Black regiment in the Civil War. He supported women's suffrage, but suggested that women use military tactics to gain their rights. This idea would later gain traction in England as women bombed government buildings to gain their rights, but it was not used nearly to that extent in the United States. Another thing interesting on this map is I added a star for emphasis, but you can clearly see where the paths of the Underground Railroad come together to be in Worcester, Massachusetts. This, of course, is not entirely an accurate map because the Underground Railroad was not a planned, physical, or easily mapped system. In fact, it was constantly changing. You may know that the people who managed the Underground Railroad system did use railroad terminology to disguise their real work in leading freedom seekers to safer places. The African Americans heading towards freedom were often called cargo. The people leading them to safe areas were called conductors, and some freedom seekers were also called passengers. There's some discrepancy in terms used there, and safe stops were called stations. Since the Underground Railroad is a secret organization, it can also be difficult to find stations where conductors lived and worked. However, Worcester County does have a few notable places that were used by conductors. We know the Foster's home, Liberty Farm, is a best known example of a private home used as a safety stop. Renovations of other older homes in the area have revealed cubbies built into the walls, so freedom seekers could hide in these cubbies while waiting for transportation to the next stop. The Blackstone Valley Canal's towpath was frequently used as an escape route for freedom seekers, and you can find the canal in its original form in different parts of southern Worcester County and northern Rhode Island, including Riverbend Farm, where this picture was taken. And the canal has been covered up in the city of Worcester, but is now called the Canal District. And finally, this was unique in that in Worcester County, this is one of the few parts of the Underground Railroad that was actually a railroad. The Providence and Worcester Railroad was in large part Quaker owned, and so extra box cars were used to transport freedom seekers to different cities. So let's travel back to the 19th century to talk about another series of events at Liberty Farm. No taxation without representation has been an American saying since the Revolutionary War. Yet in the 19th century, all residents were ordered to pay taxes, even if many of them did not have the right to vote. So in 1872, the Fosters protested this decision by not paying property taxes on Liberty Farm. You can see on this, in this letter on the right-hand side, the city of Worcester was attempting to sell their farm in order to receive some of their money in return, and Abby Kelley was writing to their good friend Thomas Wentworth Higginson to see if he would help them bid on the farm in order to buy it back while still not paying taxes. For the most part, sympathetic friends would come and bid on the farm and buy it back for the Fosters. Unfortunately, there was one time a local man attempted to purchase the farm at an auction and was not part of the Foster Friends circle. Stephen ended up yelling and berating this man until the man was ashamed and went away without buying the farm. So it was through this house that Abby Kelley drew a correlation between slavery and the condition of women in America at that time. She declared that woman is a slave and is obedient in the presence of her master. Our only safety is to rebuke the oppressor and demand our rights. This segues nicely into Abby Kelley's other major goal to get universal suffrage. Both African Americans and women should have the right to vote. This sentiment has been expressed throughout American history. Founding Mother Abigail Adams is often quoted as saying, "Remember the ladies," which marks a sentiment expressed by many women throughout U.S. history. Women have been denied the right to vote, to own property, to serve on a jury, and even to marry against their father's will. Even the most affluent and well-educated women had very few rights. Of course, there are notable exceptions. For example, right in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, resident Lydia Chapin Taft was anecdotally said to have voted as a landowner in a 1756 town meeting. This was likely because she owned almost all of the land in Uxbridge at the time, so it would be very difficult to pass any laws without her help. But it wasn't until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 that most women across the country could vote in federal elections. Now, Abby Kelley is not always remembered for her work in the women's rights movement in the same way as many of her collaborators. She did work alongside Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Paulina Wright Davis Kellogg in organizing conventions. In fact, she was crucial in recruiting Susan B. Anthony, first as an abolitionist and later as a suffragist. She would also recruit Lucy Stone in the same way. Abby Kelley would break with the main movement in favor of her own brand of activism. She was powerful and even demanding in her ways of asking for women's rights. As she was said in the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention, "I prefer not to argue about women's rights, but to take them. I do not talk of women's rights, but of human rights, the rights of human beings. I do not come to ask for them, but to demand them, not to get down on my knees and beg for them, but to claim them." This marked a shift in thinking that was quite different from many of the other suffragists of her day. While countless women across the globe were leading various movements to gain women's suffrage, Abby Kelley created her own brand of activism. It was known as Abby Kelleyism, and her followers were called Abby Kelleyites. They were firm believers in equality for all, regardless of race or gender. And putting the two, race and gender, together was crucial for her brand of activism. One of the reasons for the split in the movement later on was the separation of race and gender in a quest for universal suffrage. While she was often honored by fellow suffragettes and scorned by the mainstream press, she endured physical threats and verbal harassment while she spoke to promiscuous or mixed-gendered audiences while traveling the lecture circuit. Her husband, Stephen Simmons Foster, was of course among the Abby Kelleyites and was surprised when others did not always view him as such. He once had to write a letter to Abby Kelley saying, "One of your converts denounced me as no Abby Kelley abolitionist. I must beg leave to drop the abolitionist from the word and content myself with simply being an Abby Kelleyist." So in his flowery Victorian way of speaking, Stephen is admitting that he's pretty disappointed when this other man, who he doesn't even know, has declared his support and love of Abby Kelley and her radical activism, and dismissing Stephen as not being serious or radical enough. Stephen instead is declaring his love and support for Abby Kelley as a person, regardless of what her ideology might be. Even though she later broke from the main women's rights movement, Abby Kelley was essential in organizing the first and second national women's rights conventions held in 1850 and 1851 in Worcester, Massachusetts. Of course, Seneca Falls is known as being the first regional women's rights convention in 1848, but it was only for women in that upper New York region. At these national conventions, Abby Kelley encouraged many well-known women's rights activists to come and speak, including Lucretia Mott, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass. Local activists were also given the chance to speak on this national stage. Notable guests included Anne Hills Price of Hopedale, Massachusetts, who was a good friend of Walt Whitman and also a Christian socialist leader, along with acclaimed physician and professor, Dr. Martha H. Mowry of Providence, Rhode Island. Many years later, after Abby Kelley had separated from this main women's movement but remained in contact with its members, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would praise her efforts at the 1870 National Women's Rights Convention held in New York City by saying the movement in England, as in America, may be dated from the first national convention held in Worcester, Massachusetts in October 1850. Without Abby Kelley's help organizing the event and being one of the keynote speakers, it's unlikely that the women's movement would have progressed as it even progresses today. So during the final days of Abby Kelley's life, she lived with her sister Lucy and her niece Flora, along with her older sister Joanna in that boarding house that Lucy owned. It was located on 100 Chatham Street in Worcester. This property has since been demolished and built over, so you cannot visit this place today. Abby Kelley's daughter, Alla, would frequently take visits to see her mother and to make sure she was going on day trips. Abby Kelley continued writing until the end of her life. Her very last piece was an article about her husband, Stephen, which appeared at the National Encyclopedia of American Biography. She died within days of mailing this article for publication. She died on January 14th, 1887, exactly one day before her 76th birthday, because she had told people she really didn't want to be 76 years old. Despite her lifelong work for equality, many of Abby Kelley Foster's aspirations for the United States were not realized during her lifetime. While her work in the passage of the 15th Amendment, which extended the votes to men of all races, and the 19th Amendment, which extended the vote to women, was not passed until 1920. This was 33 years after her death. And because of her work, Abby Kelley is a member of the National Women's Hall of Fame and the National Abolitionist Hall of Fame. Additionally, two organizations in Worcester, Massachusetts, Abby Kelley Foster Charter Public School and Abby's House, a women's shelter in Worcester, are both named in her honor. And of course, if you want to view my online exhibit, The Life of Abby Kelley Foster, is currently viewable on the National Park Service website, and BHD is in possession of a pop-up poster version of that exhibit, and hopefully when the weather gets warm and social distancing isn't as restrictive, we will be able to pop it up throughout the Blackstone River Valley, where you will be able to walk outside in the nice warm air and learn more about Abby Kelley's life.